What is a protein skimmer? Are they necessary? How do they work? What makes the various skimmer technologies better than another? How to tune it for best performance? Our best tips and worst mistakes? All that is coming up. Hi, I'm Ryan, and this is the 52SC Guide to Reefing Skimmer Edition. I'm about to share everything that we've learned about skimmers in the last couple decades, starting with what a skimmer is and when do the benefits justify the space and effort. The quick answer is a skimmer removes organic foods, waste, pigments, toxins, provides gas exchange, and an easy way to incorporate ozone into your system. It's a time-tested filter that's been a primary component in reefer system designs for decades. That said, no filter is absolutely necessary, and there are many thousands of awesome tanks that run perfectly fine without a protein skimmer. Once you know the specifics of what a skimmer does and how it works, you can make an informed decision on if it's an important piece of gear for your tank. If you've ever watched waves crash on the shore and create a dirty foam, you've already witnessed foam fractionation, or the fundamentals of how a skimmer works in person. As the waves crash, they mix air, water, and organic pollutants together to create a stable foam that washes up on the shore, and if you went up and scooped up that foam with a large cup, that action would have effectively removed organic pollutants from the ocean. This is what's happening in today's modern skimmers. They suck water in from the tank, whisk it together with air from the room, the decaying organic pollutants from the water, and they create that stable foam head that flows over into a collection cup and removes it from the tank. When you empty that cup, you have completed the export of organic waste from foods that otherwise would have polluted the tank. That is a primary purpose of the protein skimmer: remove organic waste from the uneaten foods and fish waste decaying in the tank. Specifically, remove it before it fully decays and releases the nitrate, phosphate, and other pollutants into the water. For that reason, I would describe the skimmer as a preventative filter, or one that addresses issues before it becomes a problem rather than reacting to it after. Net of that is your tank is less reliant on manual labor like water changes or other filtration methods. The secondary supportive purpose of a skimmer start with maintaining crystal clear water by removing organics before they release yellowing compounds or pigments into your tank water. All the foods we put in the tank contain these pigments that yellow water over time. We can remove the organics that contain those pigments with a skimmer before they break down and they're released. The yellow pigments can reduce par to some degree, but also change the perception of color of the corals and the entire tank. If you're wondering how yellow your water is, turn the tank lights off and look through the long end of the tank to see. For many of you, you'll probably see that it's more yellow than you thought. Or next time you're doing a water change, use a white bucket, which is about the same depth as many tanks. The water in that bucket should be a pristine blue and not yellow. Next, skimmers are commonly believed to help remove the biological toxins that corals release to fight each other for territory, but also the organic toxins that algae, single-celled organisms like dinos, diatoms, and cyano release. Not likely to get them all, but they can reduce the overall concentration. Skimmers also play a supportive role in gas exchange and oxygen introduction into many tanks. As the fish respirate and remove oxygen from the water, the O2 depleted water passes through the skimmer, whisked together with oxygen-rich air from the room to replenish it. The reason the skimmer is so good at this role is the many millions of tiny bubbles that collectively create an enormous amount of surface area or air-water interface, which saturates the water with fresh oxygen. If you intend on organic carbon dosing to reduce nutrients, a skimmer is a mission-critical component of many of those methods, particularly the most popular, which rely on bacteria consuming the nitrate and phosphate along with the organic carbon that you dose. Actual export happens when the skimmer removes those nutrient-laden bacteria into the collection cup. A skimmer is also one of the easiest ways to incorporate ozone into a system. There are multiple ways to get ozone running, but it can be as simple as throw a Y on the skimmer's air intake line feeding from an ozone generator, or P controlled to inject the ozone into that skimmer. Ozone is just 3 oxygen, where one wants to pop off and oxidize odors, colors, pigments, coral toxins, and other organics. And it can even help you remove some contaminants that the skimmer would otherwise have missed by changing the polarity of the molecules. Directly or indirectly, we've seen ozone help reduce, sometimes eliminate slimes and films that develop in the tank as well. So that's what a skimmer does: cleaner, clearer water in the tank. But is a skimmer really needed, or can I do this without? Do I really need a protein skimmer? The answer is no. Nearly everything in the tank is optional. However, the real question worth asking is a skimmer worth it? That's a system design question. What is the problem that I'm trying to address with the skimmer? And is it the best tool for the job? What you're going to find is a skimmer is not the best solution for many things, but the collective functions and redundancy it provides makes the skimmer juice worth the squeeze for many. You'll know the answer to worth it on your specific tank in just a moment. Challenge 1, organic food and waste removal. My experience is most skimmer implementations are capable of removing somewhere between 30 and 80% of the organic waste from the tank. In theory, from a nutrient perspective alone, that reduces the size or frequency requirements for water changes by 30 to 80%. Somewhere in that range is a threshold where the skimmer is worth it to most reefers. Half that 30 to 80% removal disparity is simply because most skimmers are treated like set it and forget it items where I plug it in and leave it alone. That will produce low to average results. Others actively tune the skimmer for ideal foam and collection, and they'll produce higher end results using the exact same tool. The other half is every skimmer has its own max capability, so if advanced or active tuning techniques alone are not working, changing tools to one that's capable of the desired job may be necessary. That can be going bigger, but just as often, smaller. The basics of that is if you don't feed a lot, a small skimmer with minimal air is the best tool. Going bigger will not produce better results, quite the opposite. If you feed a lot, a larger skimmer with more air will increase capability or capacity to remove waste. The best options are those that help us span the gap between those two. This series will provide a deeper understanding of the science behind foam production, collection, and skimmer design, and make selecting the right tool for the right job a lot easier. That said, ideal performance is not always necessary because a skimmer is often not designed to be or implemented as the sole filter on most tanks, so its value is not standalone, but how it combines with other efforts, often implemented with particulate filtration like felt socks or felt automatic rollers, and any reasonable water change schedule. Net result is a chain of redundant filters where the felt removes the organic particles, whole foods, or waste. The skimmer, the dissolved organics, the felt misses, and the water changes diluting what the skimmer misses. This combo may be the most time-tested, widely used approach to reefing. How effective it is based on how much thought and consistent effort you put into each step. In addition, today's reefers are utilizing techniques that leverage the value of the skimmer in different ways. Biggest modern advancement is a skimmer combined with organic carbon dosing. This combo is a complete solution to excess nutrients, even on tanks that are heavily fed. When I say carbon dosing, I'm not talking about that black activated carbon that filters the water. Carbon dosing is based on dosing carbon stored in organic molecules, most often carbohydrates, alcohols, vinegars, or bioplastics. Specifically solutions like Brightwell's biofuel, Nios Zero, Aquaforest Nitrophos Minus, Zeovit, and biopellets. Lots of solutions for carbon dosing like this. What happens is the bacteria rapidly consume those carbon sources, multiply explosively, and along with the carbon, they bioaccumulate nitrate and phosphate into their cells. The bacteria is attractive to that air-water interface of the foam or get caught up in it, and the protein skimmer then removes the nutrient-laden bacteria. It's a solution that works almost too well in many cases, strips the water of all inorganic nutrients. The best solutions will actually add back in organic nutrition like amino acids or coral foods back to the tank to provide for the coral's nitrogen and phosphorus needs. In this case, a high-functioning skimmer is what I describe as invaluable because most modern approaches to carbon dosing require a skimmer to work. Same thing with ozone in a skimmer. The skimmer becomes very high value. While ozone is not a modern approach, today's reefers are using it a lot more commonly as an alternative to activated carbon and crystal clear, odor-free water because the hobby's found more desirable ways to use ozone, such as just an hour or so in the middle of the night, safety for the home, and then ORP controlled for safety for the tank. The worth it question, just a personal preference on the value of crystal clear water. All that said, where a skimmer is of what I describe questionable value, or at least performing redundant services, the first of which is smaller tanks. On a 5 to 20 gallon tank, I believe water changes are cheaper, easier, and more effective than a skimmer, and it avoids unsightly hang-on gear. On tanks this size, grabbing a pinch grip and just scooping out some water and sending it down the drain and then replacing it can be a 60-second maneuver. If you put a container of mixed salt water near or under the tank, a 1 to 2 gallon water change is just way easier than buying and maintaining a skimmer. In fact, on something like a max spec dice, you can throw a couple ATO containers below and set up auto water changes. Even on a 40-gallon breeder, you could debate the value of using that cabinet space to make water changes easier or even automated versus running a sump. A no skimmer, really no filter at all, AWC approach that worked for us is the E170. No skimmer, simply because it's a small, elegant tank and I didn't want to see gear all over it. And we also wanted it to be ultra low maintenance with as little work as possible. The solution was 3% daily water changes on an auto water changer. Net result is the tank thrived for years and only maintenance was mix up a bin of salt water every few months for the auto water changer to pull from. Dilution is effective, even on high coral density tanks like this one. I could have put a skimmer on this tank. In fact, it even came with one. But I don't think that it would have been worth it from just the maintenance and visual appeal aspects alone. The AWC approach just worked on this tank. 3% daily is effectively 20% a week, so notably more than most people do in a tank this size. That's still just over 2 boxes of salt a year. Another instance where a skimmer is a lower value investment for me is on tanks with highly effective refugiums or scrubbers. The beauty of a refugium is once it gets going, it's near effortless. Algae grows, soaks up or bioaccumulates the excess nutrient pollution into its biomass, occasionally grabs some, throw it in the trash to export the pollution from the tank. A properly set up fuge is capable of managing inorganic nutrients on its own and doesn't need supportive filters to do the job. The skimmer's role is probably more of a redundant function in this case. Occasionally a fuge can struggle for an unknown reason, so it's nice that the skimmer is there. However, if I was running a fuge, a skimmer would not be a high priority item for me to allocate a limited tank budget to. This of course is debatable, and the answer is specific to your exact install. That said, you might notice that almost all the 52SE tanks have skimmers and refugiums. To be frank, that's partially because these are dreamlike systems. Redundancy is important for long-term documented tanks, and I'm also a pretty big fan of ozone and run it on virtually all of my systems now. In fact, the Anemone tank has the Tunes Calmline skimmer, predominantly only because it fit in the space available and incorporates ozone into that system. So is the skimmer juice worth the squeeze? Something that you can decide for yourself. With that worth it question now answered, the next question is, how does it work? The forces that drive the foam. A skimmer produces a foam. The foam contains fish and food waste. Foam goes into a cup, then is poured down the drain. That's how a skimmer works, but understanding the science behind that unlocks a type of performance that most reefers will miss. Let's fix that. There are a half dozen concepts that will lead to that. The first is understanding what a skimmer really is. It's a foam engine, a technology that's designed to mix air, water, and organics together to create and collect an ideal pollutant-laden foam. One of the challenges is a high-functioning and a malfunctioning or underperforming foam engine will all look almost identical unless you know what to look for. A malfunctioning foam engine or skimmer will have tons of bubbles, the skimmer body often almost white from so many bubbles, yet they all pop at the top, almost like a boiling pot of water. Lots of bubbles. But where's that thick, organic-laden foam skimmers are known for? The nuance between producing bubbles and organic-laden foam, a big part of what we'll explore today. Good news is this is easily fixable. A foam engine or skimmer that's functioning but not adequate to the task or set up in a manner that only captures a small portion of its capability looks like this. The bubbles are indeed creating a stable foam at the top, and a small to reasonable amount is periodically flowing over into the cup. Observably, there's a small amount of liquid in the cup each day. If that's combined with nutrient levels that are perpetually rising every month, it's time to address. A high-functioning foam engine or skimmer will look like a foam head that has substance or thickness to it and is consistently flowing over into the collection cup. If you watch the cup for a minute or two, the foam would flow over the edge multiple times. When you empty the cup's liquid and clean the organic paste inside, it would resemble the same amount of food that you added that week with some water added. Real confirmation that it's working is when you test for nitrate and phosphate and they're near your goal, or at least not perpetually rising every month. That's mission accomplished. I share this concept of a foam engine because anyone can create a chamber of bubbles, but the best skimmer will be the one that creates and collects the most foam. Even better if it does it in the widest array of instances or installs with the least amount or easiest adjustments. Second concept, what is a bubble and how does it collect fish waste, food, or organic pollutants? A bubble is essentially a pocket of air surrounded by a thin layer of water. The bubble typically pops once the air reaches the surface of the water. We can demonstrate this with a container of salt water and an air pump, where we turn the air pump on and it forms round pockets of air that rapidly rise through the water, and then pop the moment that they hit the surface. A bit more similar to a skimmer is if we throw on an air stone on the end of that line. Now we get much finer mist-like bubbles, yet they still pop when they hit the surface. That's because that thin layer of water around the air just isn't enough to hold the bubble's form once it hits the surface. So what is the difference between a bubble that pops and one that holds its shape once it hits the surface? The answer is if a bubble is just 2 layers, a pocket of air surrounded by a thin layer of water, then a stable skimmer bubble is 3 layers, a pocket of air surrounded by a thin layer of water, then surrounded by a layer of organics, encapsulating the bubble and allowing it to hold its shape, even when the bubble hits the surface of the water. That layer of organics hold the bubble's shape together, preventing it from popping. The more organics, the less likely it is to pop. What creates that third organic layer? Well, the bubble itself is covered in an air-water interface that has an electrical charge. That charge gives that layer an attraction to many organic waste particles in the tank. Given enough time or concentration of organics, the bubble will get coated with these organics. So a skimmer leverages the electrical charge of bubbles to our advantage to collect and remove organic waste. To demonstrate this effect, we take that same container of seawater with the air stone running, add in some skimmate from another tank, which is waste definitely attracted to the surface of bubbles, and you immediately see the effect of what we just shared. The bubbles are now surrounded with organics and creating a foam that doesn't pop as easily once it hits the surface. In fact, you can even start to see it collect. Add a bit more of the skimmate and now you can see how even with just an air stone, we can build a foam head that collects and flows over the edge of the container in just minutes. This is the premise of how a skimmer works, and a DIY air stone model like this one is one of the foundation of today's skimmer technologies. We just use a lot more air and water these days. The third concept is the difference between a bubble and foam. And within foam, what's the difference between wet and dry foam? The primary difference between a bubble and foam is the bubbles are things that pop at the surface. Foam is the net result of the organic coated bubbles that don't pop, collecting together at the top of the water into something that looks like a stable foam head and can be collected. That stable foam head is a result of 2 things. 1, the collection of organics that prevent many of the bubbles from popping. Also, gravity is causing the water to drain away, leaving a progressively thin network of water, air, and organics that we call skimmer foam that can be manipulated or scooped up and still holds its shape. This is where that dry versus wet foam comes in. Wet foam, by nature of being wet, has a lot more water in it. It simply hasn't drained out yet. However, one of the things about wet skimmer foam is as the water drains out, many of the weaker, less stable bubbles pop. They could be weaker because they have fewer organics, because the organics on their surface have a weaker bond, gravity, elasticity, or some other pressure. A critical thing to consider is when a bubble pops, the entire thing breaks down. The air immediately goes into the room, and whatever organics were on the surface of that bubble go right back into the water the moment it pops. Dry foam, on the other hand, as the name suggests, is dry. Most of the water has drained out of it, and the foam is very stable, with very few bubbles popping at this point. One of the reasons for that is as those weaker bubbles popped in the wet foam, whatever organics were on them essentially just drained over the surface of the other bubbles, coating them in additional organics, making them stronger, more stable. This happens until essentially you've created a very dry foam that's pretty much hit its capacity for organics. It might be easiest to think of a bubble as a parking lot for organic molecules. A bubble where 33% of the spots are taken may have the strength to exist as a wet form. A bubble with 66% of the spots taken will have the strength to hold its form much longer. If 100% of the organic spots are taken, the bubble can exist in a very dry foam. One of the things that's happening in the case of a dry skimmer foam is when those weaker bubbles with less organics on them pop, they cover the remaining foam bubbles with more organics, sometimes even exchanging weaker organic bond contaminants for stronger ones that can create progressively drier foam that we talked about. Note that dry foam is capable of overcoming gravity and rising further above the natural water level in a skimmer. That wet foam transitioning to dry is something you can also see in our example. Once we turn off the air pump feeding the air stone, the wet foam immediately starts to pop, covering the rest of the foam bubbles in additional organics, a process that continues until the foam contains enough organics that it can fight the gravitational elasticity of the bubble and other pressures of the water. Eventually, it's a very dry, stable network of organics. This goes back to that first concept where I mentioned that a protein skimmer is really just a foam engine. It's a tool designed to create and remove foam, not a bubble engine, which doesn't remove anything. So if yours only produces bubbles, it's both something to dig into, but also absolutely fixable once you understand all of today's concepts. The fourth concept is contact time. If a bubble is essentially a parking lot for organics with an electrical charge drawing them to its surface, how long does it take for that parking lot to get so full that the bubble is stable, collects with others, becomes foam, and gets removed? This gets at what's the right flow rate through the skimmer? How big should the skimmer be? Are smaller bubbles better than large bubbles? Is more bubbles or air better than less air? The answer is it depends, but you can make intuitively correct decisions if you know what the forces are. First, it depends on how many organics are in the water trying to park at our bubble. If there are very few organics and the tank is fed minimally, then presumably it will take longer for those organics to fill a single bubble, and increased contact time is wise. Conversely, if the tank is fed heavily and filled with organics, then our bubble likely requires very little contact time to become full of organics. To some degree, it also depends on how many bubbles or parking lots you have. If you don't feed a lot, then you don't need many bubbles or parking spots or lots for the organics. In fact, if there's grossly more parking spots for the organics than there are organics, then each of these bubbles will have very few organics on them. The bubbles will be weak and pop before they can be collected. This is part of why more air in skimmers is not always better. Minimal feeders will often find that tuning the air down produces much better results. However, the opposite is also true. If you feed a lot, having more bubbles creates more surface area or parking spots and potential contact time for the organics to bind them with. I believe this is why there was a period of air wars with skimmers, where the ones with the most air intake were presumed better. The skimmers with more air are certainly more capable with heavy load tanks, but in a minimal fed tank, the top often looks like a boiling pot of water that produces bubbles, but no foam until the air is turned down. Contact time also depends on design. There are skimmer designs where you can have a ton of air and it still works in a low organic environment. What these designs do is take the small amount of organics in the water and concentrate them towards the top of the skimmer. More or less increasing the air increases the number of bubbles, parking spots for organics, and then the chances that they'll run into an attractive spot. Because the bubbles greatly outnumber the organics, the bubbles will be weak, rise to the surface and pop where they release what little organics that they had. The net effect of this process is more and more weak bubbles carry small amounts of organics to the surface and pop, where they essentially concentrate the organics at the top of the skimmer, which should create a stable foam head that can be removed. All of the skimmers out there will attempt to do this to some degree, but some are just a lot better at it than others. My experience is the smaller skimmers with tons of air don't concentrate organics as well as larger skimmer bodies with the same amount of air, simply because the smaller form factor has a lot more turbulence at the top, mixing those organics back in, and higher flow redistributing them back throughout the skimmer, and even exiting the skimmer rather than concentrating the top. However, I have found that turning the air and flow down in these smaller skimmers allows them to concentrate the organics at the top, so tuning it for air and organics is wise. Also been my experience that recirculating skimmers with separate feed pumps give a lot more control over dwell time and reduce the organics that exit the skimmer, particularly large options that concentrate those organics at the top better. I've also found that DC models that scale both air and flow rates down at the same time do better than AC pumps, where you can decrease air with a valve, but what that does is increase the flow rates, which is often less ideal. DC recirculating skimmers with separate feed pumps, an ideal option where you can control the amount of bubbles, turbulence, and feed rate of organics independently. The contact time story continues with the size of the bubble. The smaller the bubble, the more surface area they have and more sites to collect organics. I say this is worth knowing, but it's also not very actionable because many skimmers don't share the bubble size, so it's hard to compare. It's also worth noting that the smaller, more effective the bubble gets, the more likely you are to produce microbubbles that escape, and you can see them floating around the tank. The microbubbles have so little air that they don't actually float to the surface rapidly, and they can last minutes to hours before they pop. So small enough bubbles that they're attractive to organic removal, but not so small that they end up in the tank visually floating around, is the goal. Now that you know how a protein skimmer works, how do we use that knowledge to tune the skimmer for peak performance? How to tune a skimmer or make adjustments that create more or less foam, increasing or decreasing the organic content of that foam deliberately, and then adjusting the water level to perfect how we collect that foam. You'll know that you've done this right when the cup is consistently filled with organics from the tank, but more so when it's an effective tool for managing nutrients. Reducing reliance on other gear and monthly testing is confirming that your tune is working. 80% of the answer can be summed up in just a few sentences. If your skimmer isn't producing anything, just a boiling state at the top, too much air is likely the cause. Tune down that air and fix that. If your skimmer is producing something, but you think it's underperforming, then tuning up the air in the skimmer is the first tuning step. The wedge or gate valves are used for fine-tuning water level and collection after that. That said, the nuance of why we tune this way, how it can be done on virtually any skimmer, and other performance tweaks is what most of you are here for. The first encounter most of us had with an organic-laden bubble is blowing one. Dip a wand in water and organics, blow through it, and the air gets encapsulated with layers of water and organics holding it all together. Done right, the bubble leaves the wand and then floats away. As relates to today's topic, in some ways the skimmer neck is essentially our bubble wand, where our skimmer pump uses millions of tiny bubbles to strip the organics from the water in the skimmer body. Those bubbles travel to the top of the skimmer, where most pop and then concentrate the organics that they had on other bubbles at the top of the skimmer, creating a foam head. The air released from all those popping bubbles now blows through the thicker foam and our skimmer neck, pushing all that foam up until eventually it flows over the edge into our cup. That's what it should look like when tuned correctly. However, a poorly tuned skimmer won't work that way. When tuning, there are 5 performance states of a skimmer that are worth noting. 2 non-functional states we call boiling and white water, one simply labeled as inadequate, and other 2 functional states that reefers refer to as wet or dry. Our goal is the middle, between wet and dry, we refer to as frothy. Where you land in that is a result of understanding how this all works and applying it intuitively to your tank's needs. Step 1, consider what goes into a bubble or the dynamics of the simplest form of bubble engine. How air, contact time, and organics can be tuned to create a proper bubble. This is an example of the most basic form of bubble machine, one of the box, producing tons of bubbles. The airflow, air contact time, and spinning wand are all tuned or engineered to the amount of organics in the solution that it came with. Works awesome. Well, a skimmer is much more complex than this bubble machine. They share some functional principles. For example, with this one, we intentionally reduce the effectiveness by diluting the bubble solution with water and decreasing the organic content. Now the engine performs less efficiently, sputters, bubbles pop, and produces just way fewer stable bubbles. At the surface, you might think this is just a net result of fewer organics in the water, and that's partially true, but it's also because the bubble engine's fast airflow is tuned too high for the weaker bubbles now that contain less organics encapsulating them, that's causing them to pop before they even leave the wand. The bubble engine is just poorly tuned to the lower organic solution. Going back to the reef tank, similar to that with today's high velocity modern skimmers that sometimes are still put on low organic loads from minimal feeding or because they have a lot of other effective filters, the skimmer often sputters, bubbles pop, and it just produces way fewer stable bubbles. At its worst, a dysfunctional state we refer to as boiling, where a skimmer resembles a boiling pot of water. There are tons of air bubbles in the body, but they're all popping at the surface. No foam is forming, and the skimmer is really not removing a material amount of waste. Presuming there are organics like food and waste in the water that can be removed, the non-functional boiling state can be the result of 2 things. One is undesirably high water flow and air injection rates that cause surface turbulence at the top of the skimmer. Rather than the bubbles collecting organics from the water as they rise through the skimmer body, popping then concentrating the organics at the top, the highly turbulent water is flushing all those organics back down into the body and then exiting the skimmer. This is more common in a lower fed organic tank with a small skimmer body and somewhat oversized pump. In this case, tuning down the bubbles and water flow can reduce the surface turbulence, allow the organics time to concentrate and form that desired stable foam. The second cause of the dysfunctional boiling state is the velocity of the air flowing through the neck of the skimmer hasn't been tuned to the organic content strength of the foam. The high velocity of air is just popping the weaker foam before it has a chance to create a more stable foam head. Again, tuning down the air velocity through the neck can protect the weaker, lower organic bubbles, allow them time to concentrate and rise. Some still popping and releasing the organic content, but now doing it inside the skimmer neck above the water level, and now those weaker bubbles that are popping are coating the foam head in additional organics, creating a stronger network of organic-laden foam. Back to these bubble machines, they give a pretty good visual representation into the velocity effect. With the full organic solution tuned to full airflow, we create a string of large rapid bubbles. However, if we dilute the density of organics in that solution, we get a weaker bubble that almost always pops before it can fully form. However, what's interesting is what happens when we obstruct the air intake and reduce the airflow. The high organic solution continues to make bubbles, just slower, but the lower organic solution now transitioned from a non-functional popping state to one that's actively producing stable bubbles. The bubbles are still a bit more delicate, but the lower air velocity is allowing that bubble to form and not immediately pop. That's the effect that we're looking for in our skimmers. Tune them to an optimal result considering all factors. There's a second non-functional state very similar to boiling we refer to as whitewater. In this case, the boiling state is just raised to the surface of the skimmer neck using the gate valve or wedge pipe and now boils whitewater into the cup. This cup often fills rapidly with near clear solution and removes a lot of water but not many organics. The whitewater state is very prone to becoming overactive and overflowing with small increases in organics like a single feeding or small changes in sump water levels. Solution to whitewater is very often just tuned down the air as well. The third state is what we'd simply refer to as inadequate. The skimmer is working to some degree but not pulling out much, and because of that, nitrate, phosphate, and related pollutants are rising month after month. This might be because the skimmer itself is simply inadequate to the task, but it also can be the result of an inadequately tuned skimmer. When the skimmer is working inadequately to the task, attempt a tuning solution before considering a replacement. Tuning alone can increase the quality of the foam produced and the organics removed from the tank at no cost. As an example, look again at the bubble engine, specifically the example where there's full organics. When the airflow is obstructed, there's a stable production of bubbles, but when we remove that obstruction and increase airflow, bubble production goes up rapidly. In this case, airflow is the limiting factor, and the bubble engine works much better when we fix that by increasing the air intake. In the skimmer, that means in high organic instances with lots of food and waste in the tank, increasing air can very often take what looks like a functioning skimmer and make it even better. By increasing the amount of organics collected and reducing the reliance on other filtration methods and water changes, or simply allow you to feed more. That better tuned skimmer, the result of more air matching heavy feeding or bioload, and can be seen in the collection cup and what's being removed, as well as with the test kit when nutrient pollution stops rising perpetually. What should be apparent now is less air is not better, and more air is certainly not always better. The right amount of air is better, hence why modern methods of tuning skimmers via changing the amount of air injected is much more valuable than traditional methods of only changing the water level in the skimmer with the wedge or gate valve. Now to the two states where a skimmer is functioning, wet or dry. There's some debate if wet or dry is better, which you can decide for yourself in just a moment. The wet or dry conversation assumes that the foam engine has already been tuned for reliable foam production. We're now just optimizing for how we want to collect that foam, wet or dry. And it involves the gate valve or wedge pipe more. A skimmer that's tuned to produce a wet skimmate is creating a wet foam, which as the name suggests has a lot more water in it. The wetter foam typically has weaker bubbles with fewer organics helping to hold the form together. So they're still popping, but there's just a lot more thinner foam liquid collected in the cup. In theory, the higher volume of low organic fluid removes the most organics, which is why wet-tuned skimmers are generally considered to perform the best. If you were to watch it for a couple minutes, you would see the foam slide over the edge more than once, ideally fairly consistently. Wet skimmate collected will be very fluid with various shades of transparent to opaque green liquid. They'll have visible particles that have settled out. Pretty typical for a wet skimmer cup to be full every few days and need to be emptied. For that reason, many wet skimmer reefers use a port in the cup and a collection receptacle. Overall, tuning for wet skimmate can sometimes be more finicky and susceptible to small fluctuations in organics or sump level or water level. Assuming the foam engine has been tuned to produce a stable foam head, wet skimmate can be produced in two main ways. One, by raising the water level inside the skimmer with the gate valve or wedge pipe so the foam doesn't have to travel as high above the water level in the body. Gravity drains out less water from the foam and more water-laden foam goes into the cup. Another way to increase the wetness of the foam is actually increase the air injected into the skimmer, which adds more bubbles, often weaker bubbles, bringing water with them, popping and adding more water to the foam. The other state of functioning skimmer is a dry foam, which is, as the name suggests, dry and has less water in it. In this case, the skimmer is set up to allow the foam to rise significantly above the water level in the skimmer and allow the water to drain out of the bubbles. In combination with that, the weaker bubbles reach the top, they pop, drain the water, release the organics they contain to coat the other remaining bubbles and make them stronger, more stable. Net result is a thick, stable network of foam. The foam is typically an off-white to brownish color, a visual indicator of the organics that it contains. The collection of dry foam is often much slower, much less fluid, and can be more sludge-like. Cup is often filled and emptied every couple of weeks rather than days. However, there is one other important difference. Skimmers that are set up for dry foam tend to build up a thick organic paste inside their necks from organic coated bubbles popping and attaching to the side of the skimmer neck, coupled with less water washing that paste away. Once the cup is emptied and all the paste is removed, a pretty considerable amount of organic waste has been removed from the tank. It's my personal belief that the export that happens from that paste collection and removal is likely undervalued and an important part of skimmer performance. Tuning for dry foam is often less sensitive and can be easier, especially if you consider the paste in the neck as part of the export performance. Again, assuming the skimmer is already tuned to produce a reliable foam head, the most common way to get a dry skimmate is simply to lower the water level with the wedge pipe or gate valve. Now the foam has to travel higher to escape the neck and collect in the cup. During that extended travel, gravity will drain the water out of the foam and produce a drier skimmate. Reducing the air can also reduce the bubbles and the water they carry into the foam and create a drier foam as well. One of the reasons a dry tune can be easier is it's just less susceptible to becoming overactive and foaming over from additions of food or other organics. You also don't need to empty the cup as often. So the question, of course, is what's better, wet or dry? My personal experience is neither, and something in the middle we refer to as frothy is best. Frothy being near organically saturated, but also some of the water is drained out, creating a head of frothy, fluidly moving foam. This is something that we ran a quick experiment on a while back, which we tested 3 states of skimmate, from wettest to driest, collected the skimmate for 24 hours, diluted what was collected in a liter jar, and visually assessed them for organic concentration. The dry skimmer was the lowest, wet second best, and the frothy middle appeared the darkest, an indication that it contains the most organics. Notable that this test wasn't run long enough to collect that paste from inside the neck. This is fluid only in the cup. The middle of the pack is also a good visual example of what frothy means to me and how it visually differs from wet or dry skimmate. Now that you know what to look for, it becomes more intuitive why one of these might perform better than the rest. This test is something you could repeat at home, but better is simply tuning to the best of your ability or what intuitively looks correct, and then testing nitrate and phosphate at least monthly. Testing the end goal rather than testing the tool. Regardless of what your nutrient goal is, the primary thing that most experienced reefers are looking for is simply not higher than last month or the last time you tested. If it is, adjust to wet or drier, and then check the next time you test. Actual measurable performance in your tank is what matters. Okay, on to the meat of it. How do we apply this knowledge to our tunes? First, how to adjust the air. The best way is dependent on your skimmer design, so we'll share the most popular methods. First and easiest is if your skimmer has a DC pump with a control box and several speed settings, then changing the air draw is easy. The faster the pump spins, the more air it will draw. So more or less the up and down buttons are your best method of tuning air in foam production. I'd start low and add a speed each day until you achieve diminishing returns. You may need to adjust the water level inside the skimmer with the gate or wedge each time. I'd go as far as to say a controllable multi-speed DC pump might be the most valuable feature of a skimmer, at least the most effective tool for me. For some skimmers like the adaptive Reef line, they also have an air meter and valve in line so you can see how much air they're injecting, a performance reference and alternative to changing DC pump speed. That said, these valves will reduce the total amount of air going through them by adding head pressure, so some reefers that want all the air will bypass features like these and swap the tubes. It's worth noting that these adaptive Reef skimmers come with swappable cup inserts that change the size of the neck. If you're running on a low organic, low air setting, use a smaller neck insert so you don't need to produce as much foam for it to work optimally. If you use the higher air settings, use a larger neck sizes to accommodate that higher volume of air, but at a lower velocity that protects the bubbles. This is a somewhat unique skimmer in that it's designed to work in a wider array of environments, potentially transitioning from when you start the tank with just a few fish to when it's fully stocked with 5 times the fish and related food input. Nios is an example of a more affordable single-speed AC skimmer with an air adjustment built in, a small knob at the top that can be opened or closed to increase or decrease air intake. If your AC skimmer doesn't have that, you can use something like a Murloc valve and a couple 3/8" stem to barb adapters on the airline to restrict the air cheaply and easily. Only notable is removing air from a fixed speed pump will significantly increase the water flow through it, decrease dwell time in the skimmer, and require adjustments to the internal water level via the gate or wedge valve. The air valve method can work, just not as ideal as slowing down a DC pump speed. Alternatively, with a single-speed AC pump-driven skimmer, another way to tune is leverage head pressure. Say you need to reduce air because your skimmer is in that boiling or whitewater state. Reducing the water level an inch or two in the sump can add head pressure to the skimmer pump by making it work harder to fill the skimmer. Net result is it pumps less water and injects less air as well, just by lowering the sump level. If lowering the sump level is not possible, then raising the skimmer up by putting it on a skimmer stand will have the same net effect of reducing air and water flow by increasing head pressure on the skimmer pump. The inverse of that is also true. If you want more air on a single-speed AC-driven pump skimmer, then raising the sump level a couple inches will decrease how hard the skimmer has to work to fill the skimmer, allowing it to increase both water flow and air injected into the skimmer. To give you a window in this, we tested the Nios Quantum 160 skimmer running at 5 inches of sump height, where the airflow is just 4.81 liters a minute being injected in the skimmer. But when we raise the water level in the sump back up to 8 inches, where the pump doesn't have to work as hard, it sucks in roughly 35% more air at 6.51 liters a minute. There's also what I describe as maybe the ideal method of controlling air intake, which is on a recirculating skimmer that it has separate air and water feed pumps. One pump's sole function is to feed water and organics into the skimmer. This pump carries all the head pressure of filling the skimmer and maintaining water levels inside the skimmer above the sump levels. The other pump's sole function is air injection within the skimmer, recirculating that water and air over and over. The reason I say this is ideal is because that recirculating air pump operates with effectively little to no material head pressure because it's sucking in water from within the skimmer and then releasing it within the skimmer as well. With DC models, you're also adjusting air near completely independently of every other major tuning function, making them the most precisely adjustable tunable options. The Reef Octopus Regal recirculating option being the best, easiest to tune, and most consistent skimmer I think that I've ever used because of that. The only caveat is most recirculating options are designed to be used externally, often outside the sump, and typically very large with lots of pipes, making it a hard fit for many tanks, and also much more work to perform maintenance on. So best performance often comes at a cost. Alternatively, there's a relatively new design I call a recirculating hybrid, which is a single pump recirculating skimmer. MaxSpec's Air Aqua, really the only example of a recirculating hybrid. What this does is use a dual head pump. Both sides can operate normally by sucking in air and water to create dual foam streams. Or it can work in hybrid mode where you turn one dial on the intake of one pump and turn it into a recirculating pump, sucking water from inside the skimmer rather than the sump. By doing this, you effectively double the dwell time for the organics inside the skimmer. Ideal for lower organic or newer tanks. In fact, both sides of the pump are adjustable from partially to near full recirculating. When we adjusted one of the Air Aqua's dual heads to the recirculating style, it went from 17.17 liters a minute of air draw to 20.34 liters a minute, so not just more dwell time, but more air in this case as well. The DC motor speed will be used as a primary way to adjust the air intake. The instructions have some pretty clear suggestions for various tank styles and sizes. The hybrid recirculating feature and its effectiveness, the primary reason that we use this skimmer on most of the 52SE tanks. Now we've adjusted for air or quality of foam, looking for frothy as the goal. The next goal is optimizing for how the foam is collected. This is predominantly done by changing the water level inside the skimmer using a wedge or gate valve. Raising the water level up, making the wetter skimmate, lowering it, using gravity to drain some water out, and then making it drier. There are lots of ways to raise and lower the water level, ranging from hard and finicky to easy and intuitive. They all work, but my least favorite is probably the wedge pipe. There's just very little visual reference that's easy to see in the dark sump as to if you're opening it or closing it and by how much. Most seem to be very touchy, where limited adjustment range doesn't seem to do much at all, but then that last bit of the twist makes very large adjustments. The wedge pipe design works, but I'd say it's best for someone who wants to set the skimmer once and then not mess with it. There's also a slew of different types of gate valves used for water level or wet or dry foam production. Some are typical PVC gate valves. These work better for me than wedge pipes, but often have that same flaw where it's hard to tell how much it's opening or closing, and for most of the adjustment range, it's wide open with little effect until you get just before fully closed, and there's a small range that has big impacts. Again, sometimes less ideal for an active tuner that wants to just walk up, see what the tank needs, and make adjustments easily. There are also knob type gates like Red Seas where you twist a knob at the top of the skimmer which open and close a gate valve opening at the bottom. I find these to be more intuitive, bigger working range, and less finicky than the plumbing versions, making them better for active tuning. There's one gate style that I like the best, and that's the max spec version, which uses a geared dial. This specific one's only on the Air Aqua, and it's used to raise and lower the gate. The reason I find it easier to use than others is because that gear dial moves up and down with the gate. So even in a dark sump, with my hand alone, I can physically feel how much the gate is going up and down without even looking at it. Everyone here that's tried it agrees that it's the best of the gate designs that they've used. There is another higher end option called a telescoping water level that Bubble King uses on their deluxe skimmers. In this case, the water output or exit from the skimmer has a telescoping pipe that goes up and down and effectively raises and lowers the water level. What's unique about this method is the water level in the skimmer will match the bottom of the exit pipe. So there's a visual reference for setting the water level, just the pipe. It's by far easier than any other type of valve. There are some other things that can affect your tune or performance of the skimmer. One is consider your filter sock solution. If you change your filter socks every few days, it's a huge organic export. However, if you change them like once a month or when they're clogged and overflowing, they're just a place for organics to collect and decompose. It's been my experience that unmaintained filter socks not only have little value, but they also hurt the skimmer performance by capturing and decomposing organics that the skimmer would have otherwise removed. In cases like this, try removing your filter socks and seeing what effect it has on your skimmer. The skimmer will likely perform better, then confirm this was the right move with your monthly nutrient testing. Similar to that, tanks with filter rollers that remove organics in almost real time before they decompose will greatly reduce what your skimmer is even going to remove. In this case, I wouldn't say that's bad because the filters are supportive of each other, but in this case, that roller is going to remove a lot of the organics before they get to the skimmer, and a smaller size skimmer will likely perform better than a larger one because of the lower organic load. What we feed can also impact skimmer performance. Specifically, oily foods can shut down skimmer performance pretty fast. As an example of that, put your hand in the sump and you'll often see the entire foam head collapse near immediately just from the oils on your hand. As a personal experiment, try feeding various frozen or dry foods and see how the skimmer responds both immediately within a couple of hours or weekly performance. Changing foods may be a particularly useful solution on entry-level skimmers without a lot of other performance options. This was part 6 of the BRStv guide to protein skimmers. The entire thing can be found right here. If you like this series, we have a BRStv guide to basically everything reefing, so subscribe right here and check out the channel page. We'll see you in the next one, BRStv's guide to filter socks, fleece rollers, and particulate filtration.